Okay, so for those of you here, you can ask your questions in the chat, or yeah, you can use the chat here, or you can use the Q&A, whatever you want to do, or raise your hand. So Michael, what I'm doing, I'm gonna make you the host. Once the meeting is done, you can always end the call.
Okay.
So let me do that. Okay, all right, so you can take it away. Go ahead and share your screen and continue.
All right. So I'm going to start the screen share here. All right. So I have a board here on Lichess. Welcome, everybody. The title of this talk is Staying One Move Ahead. And this is about opening preparation. So generally, I think that this is the most important lesson when you're starting to become when you're a student of the chess game and you're trying to analyze your openings. The most important lesson is not necessarily that all the openings have been analyzed, you just have to review all the games, or that you don't even have to study them since an engine would be able to play everything correctly for you, but that you have to stay one move ahead of your opponent's preparation. So this is the title of the talk, Learning from Your Mistakes also. Staying one move ahead, successful opening preparation and learning from your mistakes. So many players get the false idea that the openings have been completely studied and it doesn't really matter whether you study them or not. The engines will be able to play them all correctly. The point I try to make here, I'll try to make here today and try to persuade you of, is that it's necessary to be a little bit deeper in your study so that you understand the middle game positions that arise out of the openings that you're playing. In that case, you would be successful out of the opening. You would be able to exactly meet the case where your opponent wants to play some sort of a theoretical opening, and yet you're ready to meet them head on. So let me start off with some examples of my play from this summer. First, a game in the semi-Slav against Grandmaster Zhao Jianchao of China. So I'm playing black here. And this starts off with the semi-Slav, which I play quite often with both colors. So d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6. I'd actually played this against Zhao Jianchao as 2019. I will share this game also with you. Knight c3, e6 is called the semi-Slav. And here, white plays bishop g5, which enters into the so-called Botvinnik variation, or this is a bishop g5 semi-Slav. Black certainly has a variety of choices by which they could avoid d takes c4, which is called a Botvinnik variation. Knight to d7 is probably the main way to avoid it. It's gotten a lot of attention recently. You can also play h6, but then you have to be both prepared for bishop h4. This is called the anti-Moscow variation, so this is a line. Or you can play, if you don't play, if white wants to play, they can also play bishop f6, queen f6, and e3, which is also an important line. So there's lots of theory to study. I focused my efforts on the Botvinnik semi-Slav against the bishop g5. Take a look at some of my research here, what I've been working on. So Zhao plays e4. This is the main move, again, attacking the c4 pawn. Black plays b5, defending the pawn. White plays e5. Black plays h6, attacking the bishop. Bishop h4, g5, again, breaking the pin. White plays standard book theory. Knight takes g5, h takes g5, bishop takes g5. Knight to d7, defending the f6 knight. So the correct, their white has two good moves here. E takes f6 is good. Also, the move g3 as played by Zhao is important, and it's a very important move. An important line is g3, delaying taking on f6. Notice that if you take an f6, black will play bishop b7, and if you play g3, black will play c5, opening the line against the rook in h1. So white has to close the position with d5, and this will get us into position. This is one of the main positions of the Botvinnik semi-Slav, in fact. But Zhao Jianchao plays first g3, which actually allows him to, and it gives him an additional possibility. A very important line is G3. Take a look. So bishop B7, bishop G2, queen B6, pawn takes, queen side castling, king side castling, C5. But here, notice D5 would simply transpose into a position we've already seen. But D takes C5 is an important variation that the Chinese Grandmaster also played against me in 2019. So on both occasions, I responded correctly here with knight takes C5. Notice this opens the line against the queen. White plays queen E2. Black plays bishop takes D2, king takes D2, and now the main move bishop H6 was played. So the question is the engines. If you turn on an engine, it will show you something to the effect 0.4, 0.00. It's still not settled, but this is a very well studied position. So the question is, what do you have? How much do you have to know? Quite a bit, actually. In the first game, White played H4 against me, and this actually is not so terrible for Black because takes B4 is fairly decent for Black. Knight E4, Queen C6 was actually played in the game. F3, knight takes C4, queen takes, pawn takes, rook to G8 quickly equalizes the game. Rook C1, rook D4, rook to H1. The best move here is rook G5, rook H7, and the best move here, as you probably will figure out, is rook takes E4. White usually plays something like rook F7, rook G4, king to F2, rook F5, king G2 back, says the engine. I don't know why it wants to go there. Rook G5, and this maintains a rough balance, in fact. Rook H7, rook G3, king H1, rook F3, rook C4, king B8, rook B4, king C8, and this leads to a draw. F7, and certainly a draw arising here. Rook F5 is drawn, in fact. Rook H8, king C7, rook A8, A5, rook A7, king C6, rook E4, king B6, and Black still has to take care, but it's going to make a draw. Rook H4, now rook F1 indeed forces the draw by perpetual check. So notice how much theory you have to know in order to make a draw. And in that game, I didn't play the endgame precisely, and I ended up losing. So actually, this is an important lesson. You have to stay one move ahead. You have to know quite a bit of theory here in order to survive, at least through rook E4, rook F7, rook G4. At least you have to know this far. Then you have to be very much prepared to play move by move over the board. So it is no use, it is no good to say that the game draws and you'll be able to make a draw unless you can actually make one, unless you can have the resolve and the strength to play well move by move over the board. This definitely will make a draw. But again, it is a little bit tricky. This is a little bit tricky as a line. Take a look at the other possibility here. Knight takes C5, queen E2, queen takes G2, king takes G2, bishop H6. H4 is a very important move, but the other important move is bishop H6, rook H6. At this point, the usual moves shown by an engine are various. The engine usually shows you moves like queen F3 is the usual move here. The engine shows you here, it's trying to say F3 as a move. F3 is an interesting move. What does that do? Rook D1 is an important move. We'll return to this. First, let's take a look at the game against Zhao Jianchao, queen F3. What does this do? It protects the pawn on F6. Black responded correctly with rook D3, but you have to stay ahead because the position is very, very complicated. Notice that White has queen F4. I knew this move, but then I have rook H5. I'll return to this position in just one second here. Let's take a look at the game. So White plays queen A8. This move is kind of tricky. So what does Black do? Well, king C7 is not very good because White plays A4, B4, knight B5. So this must be disastrous for me. So the correct move here is king D7. And how does the game develop here? Well, Black has to stay one move ahead. They still have to make a draw. It's not very easy to make a draw out of the opening. White plays knight e4, knight takes c4, queen takes c4. Black follows the move queen c6, queen takes c6, king takes c6, and I thought this endgame still favored white because generally this is similar to 2019. White still has the outside pass pawn on h2 and very good chances to get the pass rolling. So after rook d1, I started thinking for a long time. Obviously, I don't want to do this. Takes rook f6, h4, and the pass pawn starts advancing. This cannot be good for me. But fortunately for me, I have the move king d5, which activates my king so that after rook d3, c takes d3, rook d1, I have king d4, and black's pass pawn on d3 is very strong. So again, going back to the main lesson, you have to play well move by move once you're past preparation. King d5 was a move that I didn't know, but I came up with over the board. So far, so good. White played h4, which is correct. Black played rook f6, which is correct. White played h5, rook h6. Rook h1, again, is correctly played. Black here played e5. Rook takes d3, pawn takes d3, king f3, f5, king e3, e4, and here we've reached the key position of the opening, actually, in Zhao Jianchao's variation. So the main move here is f3, and the question is, what do you do? I was a bit confused here, because after king e5, f takes c4, f takes c4, rook h4, white simply captures both of my pawns. So rook d5 is not very good. Obviously, white can simply take, and rook d4, king e6, rook d3, and black is left a pawn down, lost in the endgame. So what am I supposed to do? Well, it takes a bit of resolve and strength over the board to come up with the solution here. Black has done everything right for 30 moves. So the question is, has the opening just failed? You have to be very, very strong over the board. The correct move is e takes f3, which probably salvages the game after some work. King takes d3, king e5, king e3, king f6, king f3. And what I had missed is that king g5 would simply pick up the pawn in h5. Rook d1, rook h5, rook d5, rook h2, rook takes b5, picks up the pawn, but that is not the end of the story. Notice black plays a6, white plays rook b8, black plays rook d2, white probably plays a3, black plays a5, white probably plays rook b5. Take a look at how this develops. Rook d3 check, king f2, king g4, and this is easily drawn now. This is easily drawn. If I play something like rook a5, rook d2, king e3, rook b2 is indeed a draw. So this would have drawn the game. A5. If white plays a4, obviously black still has a lot of work to do. Rook d3, king g2, rook d4 here. b3, rook d2, king f3. Rook d3, king f2, rook c3. Again, if they play rook b5, king g4 is available. If they play rook b6, king g4 again is a draw. Rook g5, rook f3, king e2, rook takes g3 will draw the game. So this is how the game could have ended if black had played this slightly better. There's no real way for white to have won this game if black had followed up the opening with some correct endgame play. King e5 would in fact have drawn the game. Rook h2 is an interesting move here, but I do believe is drawn. Rook d6, king e3, king f6, h6, d2, rook takes. Take a look at this endgame. King g6, king e3, king h6, king f4, king g6, king e5, king g5, king e6, king g6, b4, king f7, king h5, or f4 actually, takes, king e6, king e3, king d5, king d3, king c5. Now I do have to find the only move, b3, takes, king c2, and this does make a draw. So this is quite tricky, quite a tricky endgame. King g6, king e5 is quite tricky. King g5, b4, king g4, King f6 presumably takes, king f4, king e6, king e4, king d6, king d4, king c6, king c4. Indeed is a draw. So again, notice how much work there is at the end of the game. A lot of technical work here. A3 would have been met up by king d5, king e6, king g4, king f6, no, king e5. So there's a lot of work out of the opening. Black played the first 30 moves correctly, but that is just the start. You have to stay one move ahead of your opponent and be strong over the board. That was the lesson I drew from this game. Black played everything correctly, e4, f3. Here's how the game actually ended. I played b4, and this was immediately terrible. Takes, rook h4, a5, b3, and now Black's position collapses. King e5, g4, rook f6, rook h3. Or actually, no, my opponent played h6 here. Right. No, b3, the move I played was king c5. That's not useful. King e5 would have been met up with simply rook takes c4. King c5 was quickly dispatched. G4, rook f6, h6, rook f3, king e4, d2, rook h5, king c6, rook h1, rook h3, rook d1, rook h4, rook d2, rook g4, king f5, rook h4, king g5, and I resigned the game here, and correctly, in fact. So this was a good lesson. I thought that White played a sideline, but why not play this with White if the opponent still has to play very, very carefully to make a draw? Obviously, it's all quite forced up until move 31. F3 necessitates e takes f3, which would have transposed into a drawn endgame, a drawn pawn endgame, with king takes d3, king e5, king e3, king f6, king f3, king g5. This would have been drawn. Obviously, something like b4, rook takes h5, rook takes h5, king h5, king f4, king g6, king e5, king g5 is indeed a draw. King e6, king g6, a3, king g5 is a draw. King e5, king g6. Again, the lesson is it takes more than simply saying, okay, we have the first few moves studied, we know what we're doing. You have to be a little bit familiar with the position, or the most important thing, play well over the board. Here, I simply lost my concentration. Again, e takes f3 is an edgy draw. You have to be prepared to make one in a rook ending. You have to be able to salvage a rook ending if you were to succeed in your opening preparation. Otherwise, what's the use? You played 30 moves well, and then you simply lost. Let me share a little bit of my study on this position. I'll go to studies. I'll go a little bit into my study here. This is quite fascinating. The opening never ends except at the very end, and you have to be well prepared. So take a look at what I had prepared: d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, e6, bishop g5, pawn takes, b4, b5, h5, b5, h6, bishop h4, g5, knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes, knight d7, g3. There we go. We have the same position as against Zhao Jianchao. Knight c5, queen c2, takes, bishop h6, bishop takes, rook takes, and this is quite fascinating. For instance, the move rook d1 is quite complicated. Rook takes d1, queen takes d1, b4, attacking the knight. White plays knight b1, queen knight d3, c2, queen c6 is quite fascinating. The main move here apparently is either king g1, which can be played, or this move, king g1, knight f4, f3, queen c5, king h1, knight h5, knight f6, king g2, knight takes f6, knight d2, again, is very complicated. This is a very complicated position reached by force. Queen c6, king g1, knight f4 is a very complicated position reached by force. f3, queen c5, check. Obviously, white has to go king h1. Knight h5. This attacks the pawn at g3 and the pawn at f6. King g2 is forced, knight f6. The main move, knight d2, is very complicated. So c3, you would think this is not good for black, but it's actually fine. Rook c1, knight d5, queen d3, knight e3, king h1, knight f5. Again, this threatens to take on h2. Notice this would be horrible because of rook takes h2, king takes h2, and queen f2, which is just going to checkmate. White has to play here knight e4, queen d5, queen c2, knight d4, and this is quite an interesting position. Queen a4, f5, queen b4. You think white is breaking through here because they have they're going to capture on c3. No, I have knight e2, queen f8, king c7, king g7, king b8, queen h6, knight f takes c4, b takes, knight takes, queen takes, e takes f3, and this endgame probably ends up in a draw. Again, so this is quite involved and complicated. The idea here is that queen d1 is very interesting. Queen takes d1 is quite complicated. Queen takes d1, b4, knight b1, knight d3, queen c2, queen c6, king g1. Probably they could also go f3. It has to be met up by rook h5, knight d2, and c3. This is a little bit easier for black. This is not as convincing for white. The king g1 is probably the stronger move. Knight f4. Notice this threatens the checkmate on g2. So white has to play f3, queen c5, king h1, knight h5, g2, knight f6 gets us to the main position. Knight d2, c3, rook c1, knight d5, queen d3, knight e3 check, king h1, knight f5. But again, you have to find quite a few moves here to stay afloat. Quite a few moves have to be found over the board. If you're not familiar with this or you've never actually studied it, up to knight e2, well, this is going to draw, in fact. Black will survive the opening. What about other tries? Queen f3, take a look, rook f3. You already know Zhao Jianchao's move, queen a8, king d7, knight e4, takes, queen c6, king c6, rook d1 leads to a very tricky endgame, but probably draws. Notice this is again Mulyar, Zhao Jianchao, Mulyar. E5, rook takes d3, takes, king f3. Notice what the engine is telling you. f3 is slightly better for white, but it's not going to lose. King f3, king f4, rook h7. It's not going to lose. h6, d2, rook d1, rook d7, h7, rook takes, rook to d2, rook e7 is going to make a draw indeed. Rook e6, this is indeed a draw. Okay, so what about queen f4? Well, this is an exciting move. The game here is just beginning. White plays something like rook h. White plays rook h5. The main move for white is usually queen g4 is a very important move, or rook d1. Again, queen g4, you have to be familiar with the theory. Rook f5, rook d1, king b7, h4, queen c6, king g1, rook takes d1, rook takes d1, b4, and black just gets enough counterplay get by. Knight e2, knight d3, invades on d3 and threatens f2. This is decent for black. Knight d4. Obviously, the move here that will follow is knight f2, knight c6, knight g4, knight takes b4. I'm going to recapture with king b6, rook c1, king c5, knight c2, rook f3, and this does again end in a draw by force. So what about queen f4, rook h5, rook d1? Again, very interesting. Rook f5, queen h6, and this gets into an incredible fight. The correct move for black is queen c6 check, king g1, d4. The correct move is rook d3, knight takes d3, queen f8, king c7, queen f7, king b6, and this gets us into an exciting hand-to-hand combat where the game doesn't end in draw except if you play well over the board. So knight a4 check is the main move. Obviously, we cannot take on a4 because of queen e6. So we have to play king a6. It's going to be our only move. The main move for white is queen e7, by which they simply threaten to promote the pawn. We have to go knight e5. We're threatening to invade on f3. Therefore, white has to play f4. At this point, black has to return back with knight d3. This is the best move. White has to play f7. It looks like white has broken through, is about to promote a pawn, but black is poor. The idea here is that f8 promotes, meets up with perpetual check. King e2, queen e2 is a perpetual check of the position. Check here is a perpetual. And the game ends in draw indeed. Knight c5 is the last attempt. Knight takes c5 promotes. King d4, king g2. Takes, and black simply plays queen d5 check. Here again, we'll follow rook f3, knight d3. And on account of the move of the threat knight e1, white has no better than perpetual check. So white simply delivers perpetual check here. So this is quite exciting. You have to stay one move ahead of your opponent. And I'm sure if somebody plays this again, I would be better prepared. I knew this line somewhat cursorily, but now I have a much deeper sense, and I hope you do as well, of the complexities and the beauties of this game, that it gets very interesting over the board. The openings are not cut and dry drawn. They're meant to be played out, meant to be enjoyed for play over the board. So it's quite interesting and enjoyable to play a game like this, where you're challenged tactically to find the best moves and to succeed. And if you must make a grimy draw and a rook ending, okay, make one. There are some other possibilities for white way back after rook h6. Something like f3 is an interesting move, quite an interesting move. F3. This move requires some handling. F3, I think, is interesting. What does black do contrary to f3? If black takes on f6, then white has the move a4, which is very, very dangerous. So this is not useful for black. So the engine shows us rook to h8. This attacks the pawn on h2, but after h4, white has a good position. Rook g6, rook a to d1 is quite good for white, actually. So this puts the pressure on black once again. So f3 is probably going to be the new wrinkle in this position. Queen f3 has been worked out. f3 needs to be worked out to some sufficiency. Again, not very easy. F3. We can put this on stockfish. Rook d to h8, h4, rook g6, rook g8 rather, king h2. Rook takes f6, a4, rook f to g6, and this appears to draw again. Rook to g1, knight to d3, a takes b5, king b8, rook g2, and this appears to draw once again after f5, but it requires more study than you have to put in the study time to reach this correctly. Against f3, the correct move indeed is rook h8, h4, rook to g8, king h2, or king h3 maybe is possible. Again, knight to d3, f4, and black seems to gain counterplay with e5, so this seems to be okay, good signs. King h2, rook takes f6, a4, rook g6, rook g1, knight d3, a takes b8, king b8, rook g2, f5, rook a6, queen c7, knight d5, says my engine. What is it doing throwing pieces at black? Well, I cannot take because it will simply win a rook like this. So against knight d5, I do have to go queen f7, knight c3, queen c7, knight d5, queen f7, and it seems to end in a draw, but it requires a little bit of time to calculate. So again, this position, white has at least three interesting moves. You know that rook d1, rook takes d1, queen takes d1 is met up with this. Well, queen takes d1 is met up with b4, knight d2, and knight d3, queen c2, queen c6 is the line we've already seen. Knight f4, knight f4 is a very, king g1, knight f4 is a very edgy draw. That's not very easy to calculate. There's also queen f3, which seems to be met up by rook d3 when white can play queen a8 as in Zhao Jinchao's move, or queen f4, knight h5, which is very exciting. And finally, there is this new move f3, which has to be met up with rook h8. It's the only move in our position. A4 here, I believe, is not possible. So let's delete that from here. White has to play something like king h3, knight d3, f4. Oops, sorry. f4, e5, f takes, queen e6, king h2. Rook g4, queen f3, pawn takes, king takes, and this does lead to perpetual check. So very exciting stuff. Obviously, lots of things to consider. I'm going to record this. Obviously, lots of things to consider, but black does seem to stay one move ahead here, whether you play rook d1 or queen f3, but you have to know the position and be very persevering. Again, Zhao Jinchao, I realized I'm very close to a draw, but it still has to be made. This is the position where I faltered. The draw still has to be made deep in a rook ending, where it's not easy. You still have to find this move. He takes f3. So one move ahead will help you make a draw or to save your positions. If you're one move behind, thinking that it doesn't matter, it's all been analyzed to draw, not very smart. It's all been analyzed to an exciting hand-to-hand combat where you have to play your best. One more example of my recent play. I will take a look at, I'm going to close this study. Take a look at an example of already. This I played against Mihalevsky, Grandmaster Mihalevsky of Israel. So he plays knight f3, d5, g3. This is the King's Indian attack. Knight f6, bishop g2, c6, castles, bishop g4, h3. This is the standard bishop g4 line. Bishop h4. He played here c4. e6, d4, knight to d7. Actually, a knight to d7. Mihalevsky played knight c3, no, queen b3 actually. Queen b6, knight c3, bishop e7, and this is an important position. Again, it's important to stay one move ahead of your opponent. This is all theory, and yet it always develops into a game once you start playing it. So if they play c5, then black usually obtains an okay endgame with takes, and knight e4. But here Mihalevsky played a move that surprised me that I didn't know, knight h4, and this took me a long time to try to figure out what is going on over the board. So the engine says knight e4 is the move, and I knew this move was playable. But the question is, what is happening here? Well, c takes d5, knight takes c3, pawn takes, g4, bishop takes h4, pawn takes, rook c8 is probably about level, in fact. Not too terrible for black. The other line is knight takes e4, pawn takes, bishop takes, queen takes b3, pawn takes, bishop e2, rook e1, bishop h5, d5, pawn takes, sorry. Pawn takes, knight c5, bishop c2, bishop takes, pawn takes, bishop g6, and this should be a draw in reality. Takes, bishop e3, b6, bishop takes, pawn takes, rook to rook takes h4, ends up in a drawn endgame. Takes, pawn takes, rook e takes e6, king f7, rook e3, rook f4, and we've made it to a draw again in an endgame. With some precision and some luck, we'll succeed in making an endgame draw. So this is almost a forced line that had to be calculated over the board. If you didn't know this, you wouldn't have found a lot of the things that followed. Obviously, knight takes e4. You have to be persevering over the board. Pawn takes, bishop takes, queen takes, pawn takes, bishop e2, rook e1. You have to be persevering over the board. C5 here, d5 takes, knight c5, bishop c2 takes, bishop g6. It's all by force, and this endgame reached indeed by force. Michalewski does not have great winning chances here because of the ruined pawn structure, scattered pawn structure. It is very likely a draw like this in reality in a rook ending if black makes one. So again, same conundrum. What did I play instead? Knight c3, bishop e7, knight h4. I played the very bad move, queen takes d4. This move is horrible, and the engine immediately starts barking. What did I not calculate? Well, I knew queen b7. I knew I could castle, and I thought that this was actually okay for me because after takes, bishop e3, I thought this was okay. I thought I would be able to play queen c4. Little did I know that instead of trapping the white queen, I'm threatening rook b8, trapping the queen. White has the incredible move, rook to c1, which traps the black queen. So this was incorrectly calculated over the board. Obviously, if I play rook to b8, white would play knight takes d5, pawn takes, and queen a8. I saw this, but too late. I spent about 25 minutes calculating variations, but miscalculated. Rook a8, rook c4, bishop to e2, rook c7, bishop f1. Bishop f1 is a decisive advantage. White simply gobbles the whole queen side. It was gone from here, the game. After queen c4, I played the rather feeble-looking rook b8, queen a7, queen b4, but here Michalewski finished in great style. G4, bishop g7. Michalewski took on d6, hg, g5. Notice I can't move the knight because the d7 knight hangs, and it was all over for me. After rook b7, he found the very nice finishing touch. Takes. Black loses a piece. The rooks are both unguarded, and I simply lose a piece. d4, but here he found this nice tactic. Takes, knight f8, and a3. Obviously, what's happening here is that if black plays queen b6, bishop takes, queen takes, knight b5, queen b6, knight a7, queen b7, and this is run away, rook c8. So I had to resign again here. This is a typical example of staying one move ahead of your opponent's preparation. He seemed to know exactly what he was doing. But black is doing fine so long as they make a correct choice over the board. The usual knight e4 would have survived quite well. Knight to e4. Again, take a look. Knight takes c4, pawn takes, bishop takes, queen takes, pawn takes. Leads by force to a sensible defensive position. Bishop h4, bishop g6, at least to a sensible defensive position. You have to at least have calculated this far. Bishop c5, bc transposed into a rook ending. Again, the same lesson, staying one move ahead. It's not that everything is going to be easy over the board. If you're persevering and you make an effort, to calculate variations, you will be able to calculate them to sufficiency and to success. So this was the second example. Now on to one example that's a little bit more encouraging. Here's a more encouraging example. This was my game against also the same tournament in Sturbridge, Massachusetts. Here I played against Vincent Tsai, playing black in the semi-stop d4, d5. This a little bit more encouraging. Knight c3, knight f6. This time he played the other example of a semi-stop e3 instead of bishop g5. So you already know bishop g5 is very interesting. e3, knight to d7, bishop d3 reaches the so-called bishop d3 semi-stop. Takes, bishop takes b5, bishop d3, a6 is a well-known semi-stop. e4, c5, e5 is usual in this position. Black plays c takes d4, knight takes b5, pawn takes, e takes f6. Just the other day, Richard Rapport played queen b6, which I think is very interesting. Castles, knight f6. This is what he played against Mulyar. And after knight d4, bishop d7 was about equal. You can take a look at this game. Mulyar report from the Sinkfield Cup. This may be an interesting line of reasoning. I played the move that's been known ever since the match Anand Kramnik. G takes f6, castles, queen b6. And this seems okay, queen e2, b4. And here Tsai played, instead of the very usual rook d1, bishop c5. This has been all studied out to reasonable for black. Bishop b7 is quite reasonable for black. Bishop e4, the main move here is this rook a5, rook a5. The line goes rook b1, bishop a6, queen c2, d3, takes, king f1, rook c5, and this seems to be okay. Queen c6 takes. Rook c6. This is a nice move. Take a look at this example. Rook b3, queen c7, rook b8, knight b8, queen b8, king d7, queen h8, rook c1, queen c1, king f2, and queen g6, and I draw by perpetual check. There's no way to escape here, perpetual check. This is the main line of this opening, in fact. There's no way to escape perpetual check. This will all lead to perpetual. So what does Tsai play? Something entirely over the board. He played the move bishop d2, and I realized this is a very interesting move. He's saying that black will not really castle or pawn. It's difficult, and you have to play it over the board. I played fairly okay. So the first move, bishop c5. This is not bad because it protects both b4 and d4. a4. I have to take. Bishop a6. This again is not bad. So I here played rook e1, which is reasonable. The engine is suggesting bishop takes a6, queen a6, queen e4, f5, queen h4. I think this would have been interesting, in fact. Rook g8, something like rook f to e1, bishop e7, queen h7, knight f6. The engine says is even, but again, a very, very interesting game. Queen d6 looks very interesting. I think black's position is sensibly holding in this example. Queen knight e5, queen d5, bishop f4, knight h5. No, rook a3, says the engine. Again, you have to play it out. It's not certain that this draws easily. White may be slightly better in the middle game because they have the castle king. This has to be played out. This was a very interesting line again. So I play the move here, rook e1, which is quite interesting. Bishop takes d3. Queen takes d3. The engine says it was safe to castle. It says that castling would have been safe. Bishop h6, rook b8, knight d4, I thought was dangerous, but the engine says king h8, and black seems to be doing quite well, knight e5. I played here the move queen, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, queen d6, which is reasonable. The engine shows you queen e4, knight, rook a4, but this is probably okay. h3 meets up with h5, probably, again, a balanced position in the middle game. Again, what does Tsai do here? He plays the move a4, which is very interesting. This says I'll start pushing the passed pawn. Queen d5 is played by black. A5 is played by white. King e7, and we reached a position where black probably is equalized. But again, this is just the beginning. I didn't play all the middle game tactics very precisely, and again, I was both happy that I'd passed the opening successfully and frustrated that I didn't play all the middle game tactics well. So Tsai's move here was very interesting, rook e4. The engine says that this move should have been met by rook g8, and black is doing quite well. Knight e5 is reasonable. Knight takes c5, pawn takes. Rook to e1. But again, the engine shows you that rook to g8 would have been very strong because it attacks the pawn at a g2. So after f3, f6, black would have been even here, or a little bit better even. I played here the move bishop, rook e1. I played here the move bishop d6. This allowed Tsai to play f4. And I didn't play all the tactics correctly here. The engine says e takes f4, but I was afraid that this was dangerous. Queen f3. The engine says here king f8. I think this is the main move. Bishop takes, queen takes, queen f4, rook g8. But this is wild. G3, d3, rook takes c6, d2 is probably a draw. In fact, out of middle game tactics, king g7 is probably going to be a draw. Actually, the move that I played I thought was good, but wrong I was about this. Rook a to g8. I thought this is good, but this is actually quite mistaken. Take a look. Pawn takes, bishop takes, bishop to b4, king to d7, and here Tsai. Neither of us noticed that this was actually quite bad for black. Both of us thought this was okay. Neither noticed a6. Simply pushing the pawn forward, black is not defensible. So f5 simply follows up by rook e2, bishop f4 simply follows up king h1, bishop e3, bishop d2, f4, bishop takes e3, pawn takes e3, queen c2, and again the difference in the two kings. The black's king rook d1 is threatened. Queen e5 and queen a4 begins the deadly barrage of checks, king e7, a7. This would have been very difficult for black indeed. Rook a8, rook c2 would have been very, very difficult for black with the king in the center. So the question is, what did Tsai do? He came up with queen f1, but this was actually okay for black. 8 f6 followed. Reasonable now. I have a chat request. Lagging. Sorry about that. F6 was actually very reasonable for black. Takes, queen f7. And here I had a remarkable escape, which I saw. I played king c8. And remarkably, black is entirely holding in this position. I'm threatening checkmate on g2, so white has to play g3 to get rid of the checkmate threat. But now I have this incredible move, d3. Tsai had to take a draw at this point with rook c1, king b8, queen c7, king a8. Notice hiding in the corner. Rook c6. Tsai threatening rook a6, and this will end in draw. King d4. King f1, rook f8, check, king f1, check, king h3, check, king h4, check, takes, check, is going to end up in a perpetual check here on the H file. This will end in a draw. He had to take a draw here. Instead, he started gambling. He was in time pressure, but was upset that he wasn't winning the game. So he played the move rook c1, king b8, bishop c5, but suddenly I had d2, and this was no longer good for white. Notice that I'm covering all the squares and I'm attacking the rook, so black is at least equal here. Rook b1, king c8, and suddenly white was lost. I'm attacking the bishop on c5 and threatening pawn promotion. He played desperately, rook b8 takes, queen a7, king c8, and black had defended here. King b8, queen d6, king a8, a6, queen f3. This is how it ended. This is how it ended. He had to resign here. Notice the black king always hiding behind the pawn in the corner and protected along the diagonal. So this was a strange and interesting tactic by which black had escaped. Thai did not have a win with queen f1, but it is remarkable. He had to play a6, by which he would have had an advantage. So I'll close here. I'll stop the screen share. If you play your openings well, this is just the beginning. At least I played about as well as Vincent Tsai, which means that I made a share of errors. I made some errors, and yet it was freezing. I just ended the screen share. At least you have to play the middle game at least as well as your opponent. And that's probably going to be enough unless you're playing a very strong opponent, in which case they're going to outplay you. But again, successful opening preparation means you have to play the middle game and study the middle game. Against Tsai, I was a little bit familiar with the middle game features and played seemingly okay. Against Zhao Jinchao, I simply failed to appreciate the position that arose deep in the middle game, in the end game, and lost the game. So the opening, just the beginning. It will always be possible to come up with one move ahead. Your opponent will play something in your variations and your preparation, and you're going to have to play over the board. It's never going to be that you've analyzed things out completely. That will just never happen. Last point, to make this example more interesting, I'm going to take a look at the game between Jean-Christophe Duda and Vidit Santos Gujarati from the World Cup. I had analyzed this position, I had looked at it, and yet here Jean-Christophe Duda plays the same variation I think in the round of 16 of the World Cup. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles b5, bishop b3, bishop c5, a4, rook b8, c3, d6, d4, bishop b6, a5, bishop a7. You all study this variation. This is so-called the Archangel Variation. Bishop h3 is usual. Bishop e7 is the new move that leads by force to an endgame. So how does this simplify? Bishop e3, knight takes d5, bishop takes on c6, knight f2, queen e2. This has all been exhaustively studied. Yet Duda remains one move ahead. Knight takes c5. Notice attacks on f7 and the bishop. So this is force takes. King g1 is indeed correct. f6, knight f7, rook f8, king g2. Okay, there we go. This is the end game. Does this end game actually draw, or does white, who has a knight for 3 pawns, obtain a lasting initiative? Everybody says draw, and yet Duda was able to win the game. He played knight d2, rook e8. So far, Vidit's defense is correct. I have a chat here. The idea here is that Vidit knows the theory, but Gujarati is going to just play theory and going to try to win the game. So rook f1, king g6, king f2, h5, rook g1, king f6, king f3, knight e4, king g7, knight f2, and this is the key position. Rook f8 is correct, king g2 is correct, rook e8 is correct, knight d3, and this is the main position. G5, knight d4. Again, is threatening the a6 pawn, and here Gujarati Vidit goes down in flames after rook e2, king h1, rook e2, rook a1. Remarkable contraption here by Duda. He's going to win the pawn in a6, and there's nothing that black can do to prevent pawn promotion. c5 takes, b4, Knight takes, take a look, remarkable, takes a6, takes a7, c2, promotes, rook b1, king g2, c1, and now Vidit is going to get checkmated. Take a look at the sequence. Remarkable sequence of events, which simply loses the queen or gets checkmated. King b4, queen b7, king a5 is going to get checkmated indeed. Checkmate. So where did Vidit go wrong? Well, he played the opening okay, but he needed to, after knight b4, to have known c5 here. This is gonna be the last segment. I'll stop the screen share. I'll put the engine on. I'll put this on Stockfish. Seemingly, I have this position analyzed here. This is the position that was reached in Duda versus Vidit. The correct move c5, but black is not out of the woods at all. So the engine plays knight a8, rook a8, knight c7, rook a5. This is indeed correct. Rook e8, knight e8, check, king g6, knight d6, this is indeed correct, rook a2, indeed correct. I have a chat request. This is Stockfish analyzing, Stockfish 13 actually, analyzing, we're analyzing the end game from, or the opening you can call it, from Vidit, from Duda against Vidit. b4, c4 is still very tricky. King f3, rook a8, still very, very tricky. Knight e4, g4 is still very tricky. King e3, rook a4 is not, no, this is chess games, chessgames.com, and this is still very tricky. Rook a1 is still a very tricky position. Still very, very tricky to make a draw like this. c4, b4, b3, king g3, king h3, I don't know if that's the right move, king g3 probably, and it is still very tricky to make a draw, in fact. What about king f3? Let's take a look at that. g4, king g3, rook a6, rook d1, rook a2, rook d2, rook a1, still probably a draw, but very, very tricky in the endgame. So obviously takes, knight takes, h4, and probably it's going to end in there. Again, you have to stay one move ahead. Obviously, Jean-Christophe Duda won the World Cup because this was a critical game. Once he won this match, he was on to the semifinals against Shanklin, and then on the quarterfinals against Shanklin. Then he defeated Karyakin in the finals, but it couldn't have been done had he not won in the round of 16. In the round of 32 against Gujarati, or no, what was the round of 16 against Gujarati? It was a critical game, mass was reached when he showed that Gujarati was one behind. Gujarati had to be very, very prepared in his technique of endgame defense. Obviously, it doesn't lose, but it only leads to you should be able to play over the board. Not very easy at all. So again, I lost to Zhao Jianchao, having reached what appeared to be a difficult endgame than Mihalevsky, not using the fact that the game could translate into a rook ending. And these are further examples where you're going to have to, if you face a well-prepared opponent, it will never be easy. You just have to stay one move ahead. Knowing how to play well move by move is probably the most important thing over the board. It's not easily drawn, the game. It's up and down, up and down. You have to be able to stay one move ahead and be able to make a draw over the board. It's never going to make a draw just by an engine telling you that it's drawn. You're going to have to make the moves yourself. And that's probably the most important lesson of successful player, is that they're realistic about the opening. So with white, you can play almost any kind of line, such as the one that was played by Jean-Christophe Duda, and it's going to be of some advantage. With black, you have to tough it out. You have to play well over the board. If you do not play safely, or if you allow your opponent too big of an advantage, they're just going to win. All right. Are there any questions here? I'll take any questions. Successful players know that opening preparation is only the beginning of the game. You have to be able to play the middle game tactics well as know the middle game structure. I thought the only successful example of my play from Sturbridge was this example where I was playing against Vincent Tsai, where basically I was a little bit familiar with the middle game, but still it's important to be able to play the middle game correctly, because the draw is never guaranteed out of the opening. That is the main lesson I'd like you to get out of this lecture. The draw is never made out of the opening by force. It always follows into the middle game tactics. Whoever plays them better usually is going to be the winner. I'll take any questions. You may type in chat, or if you have any questions or comments. I use chessgames.com as one of my primary sites. It's a very good online database that has all of the recent games sorted there. Chessgames.com. I also use Lead Chess. The analysis engine there, Stockfish 13, is probably a good engine. One of the best engines, Stockfish. If you like AlphaZero, you can certainly use AlphaZero for your analysis. But always be aware as you play the openings is that they lead to a middle game and to middle game tactics, and you have to be realistic that you're not going to draw out of the opening. The game just starts. All right. If there are no other questions, I will let Ken take over here. All right. All right. Well, I think we're done here. If there are no more questions, so chess should be enjoyable. I think playing a sharp and interesting position over the board and into a middle game is what chess is all about. It should be a lot of fun. So think of it this way: it can be a lot of heartache, not being able to make a draw in the end game, or being outplayed one move ahead in the opening preparation by your opponent. But it can also be fun when you're playing an interesting and lively struggle out of the opening. It should be entertaining, and you should enjoy the game. So that is the upside of all of this. The downside, it's all technically hard and grinding and difficult. The downside, the upside, it can be very enjoyable and interesting playing chess over the board. You'll simply find it enjoyable playing move by move. And if you know a little bit of the opening, you're going to survive in the middle game if you play well. All right, I'll end it here.